call the Winnebago County Public Works Committee meeting to order. It's help me with the date, lost track of dates.
28th.
There, unmute me. Okay. Thursday, May 28th, presents myself, Dave Tassoni, Jim Webster. I saw Bert Girl.
Here.
Carlos Molina, and I see John Gilberti there as from the state's attorneys. And like I say, Dave Kelly may join momentarily. And basically, we talked about it at our last meeting. Resolution 20-2, that's -020. It's a resolution awarding the quote for supplying electricity for traffic signals and highway lighting. And I would so move.
Second.
Second by Mr. Girl. And like I say, we were waiting for a last minute quote based on the electricity costs, and they got that in this afternoon. There was something that sent to us, and I would ask Mr. Molina to speak that a little bit.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Tassoni. You are correct. We were waiting for the latest quote on the rates to provide electricity for our traffic signals and for street lights, and they're separated into two. The latest rate shows AEP Energy to be the low bidder for the traffic signals and Constellation for the highway lighting. This is actually, between the two of them, it's actually a $4,000 savings per year compared to what we're paying right now. And if we compare it to what we would be paying directly to ComEd, it's about $11,000 savings. So the way that the resolution is worded is for a 3-year contract, but you have the option to go with 1 year, 2 year, or 3-year contract. If you go with a 3-year contract, that's a little more savings. For John Gilberti, you should consider going with a 2-year just because the county board, overturns every 2 years. But again, the 3-year contract is an option that you have, and there is a little more savings if you go with a 3-year contract.
Mr. Chairman, I'd like to speak to that.
Yeah, Mr. Just to clarify how much savings, because other counties do 3-year contracts. We're not beholden by a 2-year contract, but how much savings that would either justify or not justify a 2 versus 3-year. Thank you.
The savings per year, if you go through a 3-year contract versus 2-year contract, it's about $400 between the two contracts.
Is there any type of savings from a 1 to a 2-year?
I don't have that. Give me a minute here.
It's just, if you had something off the top of your head, or if it's a few hundred, that's one thing, but if it's, tens of thousands, that's different.
Oh, it's just a few hundred.
Okay, so it's a few hundred. And do you know, Carlos, whether we go, would we still be locked into that rate for 3, or would they be an additional new quote at the end of each agreement?
No, you would be locking the rate for 3 years.
Okay.
And just to this is a pretty good time to lock that rate. And the reason I'm saying that is because we got a quote about 3 weeks ago, and the rate that we got today is even a little bit lower than what we got 3 weeks ago. The savings per year, if you go from 2 years, which my recommendation would be to go with 3 years, but if you go with 2 years, the savings per year is $400 between the two.
Okay, I would just add, I'm willing to go with a 3-year contract just because we got locked into 3 years. We don't have to worry about it. What's the rest of the committee feel?
Hey, I agree with you.
Mr. Girl?
Yep, I agree.
Okay, at that point, is there anything else you'd like to add to that, Mr. Molina?
No, thank you.
All right, Mr. Kelly, are you on board? You got contact?
Finally, sorry.
just to give you a little recap, we did get the quote for electricity, provider or distribution, at least, whatever it was, for the traffic signals throughout Winnebago County. They offer a 1, 2, or 3-year contract. Just a few $100 savings if we went 2 or 3 years, but the rate today is even cheaper than it was a few years ago, or I mean, a few days ago. And the rest of the committee was in favor of going forward with a 3-year contract. You got any thoughts on that or concerns? Mute. Going once. You gotta do something with your mute button, David. Maybe hold your space bar or unmute yourself. Going twice.
Bottom left, Dave, bottom
Give us
left.
a thumbs up if you're in or out, Dave. Hey, Gus, you don't have no ability to unmute him, do you?
I'm back and I was in favor.
Okay, all right. Did you have any questions or concerns about that, David?
No,
All right, so then that's on the table, that item. All in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
aye,
Any
aye.
opposed? Looks like unanimous decision. Appreciate that. That motion passes. Mr. Molina, is there anything else you'd like to add?
No, sir. I'm good.
All right, thank you. We'll look for a motion by Mr. Girl to adjourn.
Yes, sir.
Seconded by Mr. Kelly, rubbed his nose, so we'll second him. All in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
All right, see you guys in a few minutes. Thanks.
Sounds good. Thanks, David.
Mr. Chairman, I'm on the phone with Mr. Fiducia. He's having trouble connecting. Can somebody from the help desk call him and walk him through this? Or here. Anyway, that's what the delay is. He's having trouble connecting.
I have Angie on the phone. She can't get on either. Hello?
Hey, Joe, I sent him again.
Yeah, I'm on, Gus. I got on, but I just got a call from Angie that she's not getting on.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Okay. Let me.
I wonder if some of this is weather related.
Last few times.
Okay.
Bye.
Bye.
Joe,
Yeah.
all right, who are you talking to?
Gus is calling you.
He is?
Yeah, he's gonna call you right now.
All right, bye.
Bye. Okay. Gus is calling Angie, so hopefully she'll get on.
Hi, Fred.
Always having fun, Fred.
She's not on.
Nice to
down?
see you finally.
How did you ever get on? And why is Jim on your head?
Gotta unmute yourself, Fred.
I tried to talk to Fred early on and I know.
Yeah, I know. Fred needs sign language.
Cause I'm hitting the wrong button
He's
on.
got it.
Hey, Freddie.
There you go.
Okay. Good to see you all.
Good to be seen.
Yeah, are you at home, Fred?
Am I at home? No, I'm not. I'm outside.
Oh, that's what it is.
Outside. Watch out, it's gonna rain.
Yeah.
Where are you at?
I'm
Jim?
down in the dump.
I don't know. I know where you're at. You're in somewhere in the slum. We don't know what you're doing there, but I'm sure there's a woman involved.
Yeah.
Man, we got to get back to normal meeting, man.
Fred, I don't know how to tell you this, but you're never getting back to normal.
Do we have a normal meeting ever?
Oh, normal meeting. Yeah. Okay.
Dan Fellers, you'll never be back to normal.
Never was normal to begin with, Fred. Never was normal to begin
And
with.
that would make you normal.
That's right.
But we've got to get you some front lighting. You need one of those selfie cams to kind of illuminate you a bit more.
Oh,
Looks kind
no.
of dark and dungeon down there.
You don't want to see a selfie of me. This is a summer of angst. Yeah. Oh,
And it's a good looking board. I'm telling you, boy.
Hold on. I'll give you my DJ. Here's my DJ look. There we go.
There you go. Yeah.
You look
There
like
you go.
Wolfman Jack.
That's right.
Oh.
He's howling at something. We don't know what though.
Yeah, WWIN radio.
Hey man, I was out in California with Wolfman Jack. In fact, ran into him at LA airport once.
Did you hurt him?
No, I don't think I could hurt him. He's, a little short, stocky guy. I don't think I could hurt him. But I did howl at him.
We're going to the district after this?
Yeah.
Kind of miss that, don't you?
Oh man, I done lacked one of my cats in the.
I hate it when that happens.
Oh.
Yep.
I'm ready to go to work. Let's do it.
Time is it?
We got 2 more minutes. And I think Mr. Fiducia and Mrs. Gorel are still struggling to get connected.
Oh, Fiducia's on there. I see him at the bottom.
No.
Okay, I see Fiducia.
Ah, there he is.
Here I am.
We're ready to rumble.
Okay. We'll call to order the. Hold on. Okay, we'll call to order the Personnel and Policies meeting. Roll call. Mr. Webster,
Whoops, here.
Mr. Hoffman. Here. Mrs. Red.
Here.
Mr. Kalinkas. Or not Mr. Kalinkas, Mr. Kelly. Damn.
Here.
Okay, I believe I got everyone. I believe we do have a quorum. I have one item on the agenda tonight. That's the letter to the airport board. May I have a motion?
I'll move.
Okay, seconded by Mr. Webster. I believe Mr. Kelly motioned, Mr. Webster seconded. Any discussion on that letter?
No, I think it should be sent.
Mr. Kelly?
Thank you, Chairman.
Is it now addressed to the board or is it just to Mr. Dunn?
I believe it is addressed to the board chairman.
We are looking at flash flood warnings in Carroll County and a sliver of Whiteside County. So National Weather Service did trim that back a little. So only looking at a small part of Whiteside County here.
Everybody hear me? It's addressed to the chairman of the committee.
Throughout the afternoon. Note though, the showers are
Yeah,
fizzling out.
I heard you, and I think it should be CC'd as well to Mr. Dunn.
I believe it is. I think Mr. Kalinkas could maybe address that.
Sure. Okay.
So new areas of flash flooding may develop with
Some-
additional showers and storms.
Somebody needs to mute. I can hear their
Much of the rain that's
television in the background.
will be fizzling out upon arrival. So maybe looking at light rain showers with small little bursts of heavier.
That would be Mr. Kelly.
Necessarily looking at much to induce more flash flooding. All that may take place to our southeast late tonight. We dry on out and we'll stay dry for some.
Hey, there's the weather report.
Mr. Kelly, could you, Mr. Kalinkas, could you go ahead and brief us on who that letter is CC'd to and who it's addressed to?
Sure, Chairman. After the discussion, and then I had a conversation with you, I think it was yesterday. The letter was crafted so that it was not sent to the airport director. It was actually sent to the chairman of the board of the airport board. And we right now have it CC'd to the members of the board. We can certainly add a CC to the director if that's what your preference is. And it's going to have to be printed on county stationery anyway. What you have, and Steve, I don't know if they all got it, but what you have is simply a draft that just says a spot for county letterhead. It doesn't, it's not on county letterhead.
Mr. Kalinkas,
Yes, Mrs. Red.
what did you change? I didn't read a second letter. Maybe it came in and I didn't see it.
All it changed was the letter. The original letter was addressed to the director of the airport. This was changed to now be sent to the chairman of the board of the airport.
Okay.
That's the only change.
You'll CC a copy of it to the director.
If that's what the preference of the board is, absolutely. That's just simply adding a line.
Can I ask, who is the chairman of the airport?
I believe it's Paul Cicero.
Okay.
Is there any way I can ask if you can resend out that letter to everyone? I'm looking through. I didn't receive it unless if it just went to the county email. So if that could be sent out, that would be great.
Yeah, me too.
Can you send it now? Okay.
Yeah, it'd be nice to read it tonight.
Mr. Chairman, Mr. Fiducia, the letter was sent out by Stacy this afternoon, along with the resolution. So I don't know. I assume to the normal emails that you received.
I believe it was sent out to everybody.
It was.
I believe it was sent out to everybody. If everybody wants to take a peek at it, I'm sure there's going to be some spirited discussion reference this at the board meeting. Mr. Arena?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I believe the letter may have been sent to the members of the Personnel and Policy Committee. I don't think it was sent to the entire board because I don't see a copy of that letter and the resolution in my emails either.
I can confirm that as well, nor is it in the board agenda packet.
Right. So please, if we can resend to the entire board now.
I don't see it either.
Mr. Chapman, would you be able to do that at this point?
Yeah, let me try.
With that,
If you forward it to me, I can get it out quickly.
that's fine. Is there any further discussion on this correspondence?
I think we need to see it. I need to see this letter. I haven't seen it.
Dorothy, it's basically the same letter, except they changed directing it to Mr. Dunn to Mr. Cicero, the chairman of the airport board.
Okay. Thank you.
Chairman, I can confirm that the only change was after the conversation with you and listening to the at least the Republican caucus on Tuesday. At your request, I simply changed the addressee. We had to change a couple things that said, you when it was directed to the director to the director rather than putting that in there. But the content of the letter is absolutely the same as it was.
If I'm hearing no further to move this thing right along, I'd like to take a vote on this. If we aren't comfortable, we can wait. But I'd like to take a vote on this. All in favor of the resolution sending the correspondence to the airport board signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Aye. Aye.
Aye.
Do I have any opposed? Hearing none, the resolution passes. Is there any further matters to come before this committee?
No,
Hearing none, I'd like to take a motion to adjourn.
I got it.
Okay, by Mr. Webster, seconded by Mr. Hoffman. All in favor?
Aye.
We're adjourned.
Aye.
I apologize, but I guess I'm not computer savvy. Thank you.
Thank you for sending that out, Mr. Chapman.
You get it?
Okay, we can go ahead and call the May 28th board meeting to order. There are no agenda updates. With that, I will ask the clerk to please call the roll.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mrs. Crosby. Mrs. Crosby. Mr. Fellers.
Here.
Mr. Fiducia.
Finally here.
Mr. Girl.
Been here.
Mrs. Gorel. Mrs. Gorel. I thought Angie was on.
Was.
Is that Mrs. Gorel?
Yes. Yes.
Thank you. Mr. Hoffman.
Present.
Mr. Kelly.
Here. Here.
Mr. McDonald.
Here.
Mr. Neighbors.
Here.
Mrs. Red,
Present.
Mr. Salgado,
Present.
Mr. Schultz,
Here.
Mr. Tassoni,
Present.
Mr. Webster,
Here.
Mr. Westcott,
Present.
Mr. Arena,
Here.
Mr. Billich,
Here.
Mr. Booker,
Present.
Mr. Butita.
Here.
Thank you, Chairman. We only have one absent this evening and 18 present.
Okay, thank you very much, Clerk Gamow. With that, I will turn things over to Mr. Tassoni for the invocation and pledge. We will ask everybody to remain seated. Mr. Tassoni.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Dear Lord, we thank you for another blessed day here on earth, even though it's just a little soggy one. We thank you for the opportunity for us to meet here on Zoom here and conduct county business. Dear Lord, we ask you that those suffering due to this virus, that you bring them relief and make us all well someday and let us get past these hard times. We always ask that you protect and watch over our servicemen and women, our medical personnel, all the people that are dealing with this and doing the best they can under these trying times. Amen.
Amen.
I pledge allegiance
Allegiance
to the
to
flag
the flag
of the United States
of America,
and to the republic
which stands one nation under God,
God,
indivisible,
and
liberty and justice.
justice for all.
Thank you very much, Mr. Tassoni. Our next item of business is public comment. Gentleman that is joining us via Zoom is Mark Magnuson to talk about the shutdown. Mr. Magnuson, are you still with us, sir? Oh, there you are. Go ahead and unmute yourself. Okay, sir, go ahead and unmute yourself, bottom left hand.
How about now?
And you got 3 minutes, and thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you for the invitation that we had. It's pretty nice. I just hope this phone gives me my good angle because I don't have the good looks of Wolfman Jack to be looking good here. And first off, I'd like to introduce myself. My name is Mark Magnus, and I was born and raised in graduated from Jefferson High School back in 1973. So I've been around for a while. For most of my adult life, I have lived in Winnebago County, and I've retired here, not because I have to, but by choice, because this is my home. I appreciate the work that the county board has done, and I want to thank you all for your hard work, and I'm sure it's quite thankless at times. But I have a few thoughts I would like to bring to the table. I sent an email to Mr. Schultz, and he kindly sent me an email back, and I also emailed Mr. Haney on the 19th. I've not heard back from him. I don't know if I got out to him, but nevertheless, this is what I'm going to be covering, is what I talked about there. First as far as the board goes, I'm kind of shooting from the hip here because I'm looking at the board minutes, and they have not been issued since January, so I'm not sure what has been taking place on the board. Also on the website there, on the Winnebago County website, also look at the legislative agenda, and that has not been updated since 2018. I understand how things slip by. I'm on your side. I'm part of this community. It's also. But with that, I can only look at what the agendas have been up to now, and I'm just wondering if we, as far as this virus goes and this shutdown, if we have any internal leadership to the state as far as what our windfalls are not windfalls, but our shortages of budgets are going to be. How much, has it been estimated? What kind of money, and have these numbers been forwarded to the governor? Has the governor responded to our little community up here? Because I see him going between. It's not critical, but I see him going between Springfield and Chicago, but I don't see him making it in Winnebago County. With that in mind, if we don't have any openings or any plans to open this county, we're going to be following the state. And quite frankly, at the end of the day, the state isn't going to give us any help to open us back up. So I'd like to do done with the board here is take some kind of strategic look at what our shortfalls are going to do and what we're going to do to open back up. From the White House on down has been like retroactive, and I'm going to sound real cold here, but I'm going to say it anyway. It's a $2 trillion stimulus package because of just the problems being caused by this virus. $2 trillion and divide that by the number of deaths. We've spent $20 million for each person that's passed away, and it's not stopping anything. And I really would like to see this board continue to do its good work and to maybe move ahead of the problems and get through them. And again, thank you for all your work. And I've had
Thank you very much, Mr. Magnuson. Appreciate your comments. I just looked in my email. I don't recall seeing one from you. I do have your email though, sir, so I'll follow up with you. What you sent to me, I do not believe I received. I apologized if that got missed.
that's not a problem. I'm not here to fall blame or anything else. I'm here to participate and see what I can do to help. And if I can't do something to help, please let me know. I'm more than willing to do it. I'm retired, so.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Mr. Magnuson. Appreciate your comments this evening. Moving on to our next item on the agenda, board member correspondence. Any comments by board members? Mr. Booker. Mr. Westcott, you're next.
Thank you, Chairman. I do have a proclamation of support to establish guidelines for responsible reopening of Winnebago County. Whereas Winnebago County, the state of Illinois, and United States of America are in the midst of a global pandemic created by the COVID-19 virus. And whereas the County of Winnebago acknowledges that there are aspects of the ongoing public health crisis that are appropriately addressed on the state and federal level. It also believes that local governments may set rules and regulations that take into consideration local conditions that are intended to protect the health and safety of the community. And whereas the Winnebago County Board recognizes the economy of Winnebago County has suffered and continues to suffer from the effects of the ongoing public health crisis. And whereas Winnebago County Board wishes to support responsible reopening of the Winnebago County economy while maintaining public health protocols as directed by the Winnebago County Health Department, the Illinois Department of Public Health, and the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention. Now therefore be it proclaimed that the Winnebago County Board of Winnebago County, Illinois, that supports the establishment of guidelines for the responsible reopening of Winnebago County businesses while observing public health protocols as directed by the Winnebago County Health Department, the Illinois Department of Public Health, and the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention. Winnebago County believes that businesses, services, and places of worship are essential and that they should be able to participate in a phased reopening following public health protocols as directed by the Winnebago County Health Department, the Health Department of Public Health, and the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention. The Winnebago County Board, while wishing to support a reopening of businesses, services, and places of worship in Winnebago County, continues to support the efforts of the Winnebago County Health Department, the Illinois Department of Public Health, and the Centers for Disease Control, and encourages all businesses, services, and places of worship to do so. The Winnebago County Board makes no promise as to the insurability or licensure of any individual or business for operating in a manner inconsistent with any executive order or state statute or guidelines issued by the Winnebago County Health Department, the Illinois Department of Public Health, and the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention. The Winnebago County Board encourages all county residents to conduct themselves in accordance with guidelines of the Winnebago County Health Department, the Illinois Department of Public Health, and the Centers for Disease Control, and to demonstrate their commitment to the health and safety of the community to act in a socially responsible manner. Any person who does not adhere to these guidelines and acts in a reckless manner will be subject to all available remedies at law to protect public health and safety. And I'm asking for the board's support of this proclamation. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Mr. Booker. Appreciate your comments. Mr. Westcott.
Thank you, Chairman. Can you hear me?
Yes, sir.
Okay, I would just like to say something about how we should become one again. And by that, I want to look at possibly going over to Memorial Hall to do these meetings. It's an inconvenience for everybody, and I know that. And if we could actually go to the Memorial Hall, do the social distancing and whatever we need to do, so we can do this one-on-one and looking at each other while we're doing this and talking. I just, I hope that we would at least consider in the next go around that we do this and in the next few weeks. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Westcott. Any other board member comments? Yes, Mr. Webster, then Mr. Arena. Mr. Webster.
Thank you, Fred, for bringing that up. I brought that up at our last board meeting, and I was going to ask the chairman if he had any follow-up ideas about that, because he did acknowledge that that might not be a bad idea. So anyways, Mr. Chairman, what do you think of Mr. Westcott to my idea about that? Was there any, did you happen to look into that, or maybe the help desk, did they look into that, or?
Yeah, I have that. That's a great question. I appreciate your comments, and Mr. Westcott's. I have a mention of that under the chairman's report, so I'll definitely be commenting on that, and Steve can jump in as well at that time. That's definitely on the agenda, and I know that's a hot topic. So thank you very much. I believe Mr. Arena is next. Mr. Arena.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Two things. One, I just wanted to ask, a gentleman spoke before our last board meeting about being denied access to the courts and the eviction system. The circumstances he expressed should not prohibit him from using the system to take care of his housing issue. I know Chairman Haney, you said you were going to follow up with him. Was his situation resolved?
I did have a conversation with him. If our last board meeting was 2 weeks ago, I think over that weekend or early the next week, and forgive me if I'm off a day or two, we had a relatively lengthy conversation. There was a development in his situation that he was dealing with, and that took precedent over everything else. And he agreed to get back to me when that was resolved. So we had a productive follow-up conversation, but that was the extent of it, based on a development that was personal to his situation.
Okay, thank you. And then I'd like to respond to Mr. Booker's proclamation. I do think that this board needs to be more active in the decision-making process on what's been happening in our county. He read that. I didn't have a chance to actually, obviously see what's on the paper, but it sounds from what I heard that it's deferring pretty much to the Winnebago County Health Department to be making the decisions. And I have disagreement with decisions that have been made throughout this process by whoever has been making them. For example, that we allowed people to congregate into larger stores unsafely while closing down stores that could have been operated safely. I think, all of us could agree that that could have been done better. And I'm sure other aspects of it, we don't need to hash it all out here, but I think what has to happen is that we have to have possibly a public safety meeting that we really go into some detail about what has happened and what needs to change before we sign on to a proclamation like that. That's just my take on what I heard. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. McDonald.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I think it's a great idea. Maybe we could get Steve to set up a joint public safety operations, because I think this comes also within the operations, how the county operates. But I agree. We've been talking about taking a leadership role and moving forward on this. We've not done that yet. So, Mr. Chapman, if you would, could you have a joint committee next week with public safety and operations so we can discuss this. And Mr. Booker, would you please email that document to the rest of us so we have a chance to pre-read it?
Absolutely. I just received it today, or the final draft anyway. I will do.
Thank you, Mr. McDonald. Mr. Booker, thank you. And Mr. Tassoni, you had your hand up.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And Mr. Booker, yeah, I would agree mostly in whole, or at least in part, majority of the part with your proclamation there. But, and this could be wrong because I read it in the media, but and you had made comment that we would use every remedy necessary to enforce whatever these restrictions were. But I'm pretty sure I saw in the media that the sheriff would not enforce the governor's orders, at least. You had made comment about more so of the health department administration and the CDC. But if our sheriff is vocally saying he's not going to enforce the governor's orders, why would he enforce our local orders?
So we'll follow that up. It's a question. There's several questions around this topic. What if there's a call for a joint meeting between public safety and operations? Then let's agree to have that meeting scheduled for in whatever day that can be mutually agreed upon by their committee chairman, and take some time and unpack that, because there's a lot of pieces to it. The only piece I'd add real quick, Mr. Tassoni, is the sheriff's department and sheriff's department around the state are less involved significantly by statute than public health departments in the middle of a pandemic. If it was a different type of issue, then the sheriff's department would have more of a direct role on enforcement, obviously. But in this case, actually, the enforcement component on executive orders or legislative action taken by the General Assembly falls to the IDPH and or the local health department in that case. So they're more of the enforcement arm during a pandemic. But we can talk about that in much more detail. What I'd also encourage to get a public health perspective is that you coordinate that with Dr. Martell's schedule so that it's a balanced conversation, and you can have that nice back and forth of a true dialogue. I'm sure she'd be game to do that if there was coordination. Mr. Billick.
Yeah, I just wanted to follow up, actually reverberate everything that was said there. And at the same time, I wanted to say I do agree with Mr. Booker. Mr. Tassoni, what you said absolutely makes sense. It's a good question, because I just wanted to go ahead and add on to that. As far as the local small businesses, it has been the health department that's been actively policing that. With the sheriff's department, they've been policing more of the social distancing protocols. As far as the individuals, or if they're violating that, and then they're the ones that come in and shut it down for a moment. Local police departments have been a lot more active in that kind of regard, because they are in charge of a lot of their municipalities, and our municipalities have their local police departments. So I just wanted to go ahead and clarify that portion of it. But as far as everything that was said by Mr. Booker and Mr. Westcott, I wanted to say I agree with that. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Mr. Billick. Appreciate it. I have Mrs. Crosby, then I have Mr. Hoffman. Mrs. Crosby.
I just want to have Lori count me as present as of 6:20. I finally got into the site. Thank you.
Thank you, Mrs. Crosby. I see a thumbs up by Clerk Gummau, so you're in as of 6:20. Mr. Hoffman.
Thank you, Chairman. Mr. Booker, in that proclamation, in your mind, does that include the wearing face masks when necessary?
Wearing face masks is up to the individual, unless that individual goes on to a property. The owner of a property has the right to enforce or demand the wearing of face masks. But again, wearing face masks is actually up to the individual.
When it's posted on a store that people should have face masks before they come in, do you still consider that the person's decision, or that retailer, or that industry, whatever it may be's choice?
The owner of the property has that choice.
So if a person comes in there and does not wear a face mask, what should be done about that?
Well, the store has the right to ask that person to leave. says you're going to have to leave if you refuse to put on a face mask. And if that person refuses to leave, then the property owner, store manager can call the police, and there's potential charges of perhaps disorderly conduct.
I'm just, what I was just basically asking is that I agree with everything you said. I just want to make sure that's how you guys were looking at that proclamation. Thank you.
Right.
It sounds like, oh, go ahead, Mr. Booker.
Yeah, I just, there's a lot of businesses that are ready to open, more than ready, and we're at a crisis stage as far as the economic crisis now, and it could be far more devastating. So we've got a lot of citizens that are looking for us to speak for them, and that's what I'm doing with this.
So we will refer that to the joint committee meeting. Are there any other
Yes,
any other comments? Hold on, Mrs. Gorel. I got Mr. McDonald, then Mrs. Gorel. Mr. McDonald.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm just curious. I know tomorrow we're supposed to be moving into the next phase as a state. Does that occur at midnight, or is there another time?
My understanding is it's at midnight. It was not specified otherwise, so it'd be midnight. It'd be 12:01, I guess, a.m. We'll get to that in a little more of an update here in a second. Any other comments? I apologize. Somebody had their hand up. Oh, Mrs. Gorel. Mrs. Gorel.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I know many of our board members aren't free in the afternoon to watch you, Mayor McNamara, the governor, and Dr. Martell on television around 3 o'clock. You did a great job today, and you did a lot of explaining. Many of the things that Mr. Booker is talking about, this has already been planned to be opening up with the third step, I believe they call it. And if anyone wants to, I believe you're on YouTube, are you not, Chairman, when they do that in the afternoon?
So the press briefings right now are Monday, Thursday, 3:30, and they're usually on all three. Last I checked, all three TV stations.
They are.
But that, again, that in no way gets in the way of the board having a very robust discussion.
No,
this
it
week.
would give them a better understanding of what's really going on. Many of our members are getting information from all over and what people think are going on. They need to be brought up on what actually is going on. And some of these things are going on already and they're not aware of it. So this is something that perhaps if they can't do it during their daytime because they're working, they can go on any of these stations and watch it or listen to it on YouTube so they can get caught up and they'll have better answers for the people who are asking them these questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Mrs. Gorel. Mr. Tassoni.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I would just say that I think today may be the first day that I didn't view the county and health department's press conferences. Excuse me if you've already mentioned this or the information's out there. And I guess primarily the administration building, because maybe that's the specific building that you control other than the other departments or elected officials. When will you be opening to the public in some fashion, and what will be your or the administration's position on wearing a mask or not in our, to safeguard our own employees and other public?
Great question. And with your permission, this will segue into, unless there's any other board comments, it's a segue into what the information I was going to provide. A press release went out related to June 1 is going to be the reopening of the county administration building. Yes, Mr. Kurlinkus, just 1 second, I'll be right to you. Press release went out on the opening of the county administration building. Elected officials within the county administration building still have the right to run their office as they see fit. However, there's a common agreement that you will be entering this building wearing a mask. There is a right to refuse service if you do not wear a mask. Employees inside the building will be wearing a mask. The only exception that is stated by IDPH, I've had this drilled in my head, is if there is a medical exception, and that's the only exception to my understanding. But there was agreement with Steve and also the elected officials and also the administrative department heads universally when this was discussed last week, that we're going to be open more formally to the public and officially the public June 1. But specific changes and tweaks will be, at the discretion of like a Nancy McPherson as a recorder. The commonality is you're going to see a lot of face masks. Employees are asked to wear them at all, while they're working as well. Mr. Kurlinkus, I'll let you jump in. I apologize. I just wanted to get that one out. Mr. Kurlinkus.
That's fine, Chairman. I'm just trying to, the state's attorney would like to make a statement here.
Go ahead, Marilyn.
Hi, everyone. This is State Attorney Marilyn Height Ross. Just wanted to respond to Mr. Tassoni and to concur in what the chairman said. I have had protocols in my office in place for approximately 6 weeks. Those were put in place regarding following the guidelines of the CDC as well as the state health department and local health department. So any individuals in my office have to wear face coverings. We have limited outside visitors to the office, and that has been in place for approximately 6 weeks. We have a protocol for servicing individuals that will go into effect once the courthouse reopens June 1st, where we have certain questions. If they don't want to wear a face covering, they will still receive services, but it may be via email, etc., to protect themselves and the other employees. Everyone in my office, including myself, wears a face covering. All officers that come into our office for services wear face coverings. And that has been in place for several weeks. And, hopefully, that keeps everybody in the workforce in my office safe, as well as the officers they interact with, because we are and do provide essential services. So those are protocols that I have put in place. I have also relaxed my sick leave policy because we don't want people coming in if they're sick, and we also don't want them penalized if they have symptoms that they may feel may be COVID-19. So those are just some things I want to share with you since you brought up about county employees. And I think all of the elected officials are doing their best to make sure that protect the county employees that provide essential services. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you very much. So you have basically different islands. So for example, River Bluff, the amount of CDC protocols they go through on a daily basis it's like a different planet and world compared to the general administration building where we have committee meetings and such. The judge has weighed in. They're opening up at their own pace as well. The state's attorney's office done a great job. How the jail is operating is under very strict CDC and IDPH guidelines. And the feds actually called them out and said, what a great job they're doing being proactive. And I want to thank Steve for getting all of the elected officials and department heads together inside the county administration building early on to make sure that we were ahead of the curve as well. There are some basic things you may see different. Some of the county administration departments serve the public at a lot higher volume. The recorder's office, the clerk's office, the treasurer's office, as a couple examples. You're going to see some plastic coverings and barriers that have been put in place at minimal cost collectively. So it's going to have a new feel. There's going to be social distancing, and it'll be a little bit different, but it is going to be opening up. And that would be a good thing. I'm going to take questions at the end because I got a number of COVID things I just want to put in front of you. I know we could, if we're going to have a larger COVID discussion, some of the follow-ups could obviously fall to then as well. One of the things I would ask you to keep a look for, and it's very important, is that tomorrow, the first day of phase 3, I anticipate, if I'm betting, the governor will likely come out with another executive order that would codify the guidelines that he's been given. The executive order actually ends, and what he's done the first time is he created an executive order. Then he had another executive order to extend it because the legislature wasn't in session. Then the legislature got in session, but they didn't do a darn thing relating to reopening discussion. And I am just, in my opinion, editorializing, deeply disappointed they didn't take action, but they didn't. And so what I anticipate, and I could be wrong, is that the governor will likely codify the restore actions of phase 3 in that in an extended order over a period of time, maybe 30 days, starting tomorrow. I could be wrong, but if you don't see an order that comes from the governor tomorrow, then really there's nothing other than guidance and suggestions. When it becomes an order, then it has the weight of action, official action from the state. There are people challenging that in the courts, and that's not for me to decide, but it becomes more official if he takes that type of action tomorrow, short of what the General Assembly didn't take action last week, to my dismay. So that's one thing to look at tomorrow. Tomorrow, real quick, in case you haven't seen, all remaining manufacturing is open, offices, retail, barbershop, salons, campgrounds. You can have a foursome in golf, I guess. All state parks are now open. Restaurants for outside dining. Here's one thing that's been a hot topic, and I know all of you have heard about this. The Illinois Restaurant Association a week ago or 10 days ago was advocating for 25% reopen of inside dining. That's the Illinois Restaurant Association. They must have negotiated with the governor's office because all of a sudden the outside dining thing came down, and that is now the position of the Illinois Restaurant Association. So it is not just local municipalities and counties working with the state or health departments like Dr. Martell's team working with ITPH. You also have associations like IML, the Illinois Municipal League. You have the Restaurant Association. They are negotiating some of this stuff at a very high level as well. And that I was very disappointed. We thought we had alignment, and we thought we could work a plan at 25%. Plan on indoor restaurant dining, and it wasn't a one-off thing. That may be something that we push if things continue to go well, as asking for reconsideration on that in a couple of weeks as things continue to go well. I think there's a way to safely do that. I won't belabor it. I know people did. I do want you to know, if you have people calling you saying, why did this happen? The Illinois Restaurant Association, I think, changed their official position with the state, and that helped set things in order. Child care is in the process of getting finalized. Very complicated discussions there, but that is coming back online. Churches with a lot of local guidance. We had Christian, Jewish, and Muslim faith leaders get together and come out with best practice guidelines based on science, based on research around how to safely reopen churches and social gatherings 10 or less. Not perfect. There's a bunch to discuss in that joint meeting next week. I would again reiterate, including Dr. Martell, to get her feedback in these type of discussions so that it's an aligned discussion going forward. I'm sure she'd welcome that type of thing. But at the same time, it gets weird because at the end of the day, the health department is empowered to enforce things that come down from the state. It's not like a chairman thing or a county board member thing or a mayor thing or anything like that, or a council thing. There's actually unique powers invested in a public health department during a pandemic. There are 2 counties in the state of Illinois that do not have a health department, and one of them is Clay County, and I think they're one that has been pretty vocal about their thoughts on reopening. There's 2 stats I wanted to share with you that are very important that I heard today. And I would just say this is important stuff because part of reopening is that people show up. So when we reopen a Murphy's, that people show up the way they did before the shutdown. There was a study done nationally, 85% of consumers, national study, said that knowing that there were proper cleaning protocols and safety measures in place would give them confidence going back to an establishment. So the communication efforts by business owners and also our community about proper protocols is apparently a very key thing to people actually showing up when they have the ability to. There's going to be more on that coming locally. The other thing is they did a study of right now, only 35% of people in a different study feel confident going to local restaurants. That was some data shared by the Visitors and Convention Bureau today. I'll share the sources My point is this: the more we close the gap between people feeling safe where they're going, the more they're going to show up. And that may turn out to be as big of the consumer confidence piece may be as big of a thing as anything else as we go forward. So I know there'll be, we can talk about that again next week as well. Future meetings, to Mr. Webster, Mr. Westcott's point, there were some discussions preliminary about the idea that there's going to be a whole lot going on June 1st, that first week or so, on reacclimating a lot of new bodies coming back to the administration building. We may not be ready to go for an in-person 20 plus board, 20 board members plus friends in person until the second board meeting in June. If it can be done safely without upending a bunch of other also important things, we could work it out, but I don't know that that's going to be possible for the full board meeting. Committees could start meeting, but I would just say this: there's some hesitancy that maybe that second cycle in June to do that. That's the feedback I heard from staff. Steve, was there anything you wanted to add to that topic? I know you weighed in on some thoughts.
No, not really. I think we had discussed the issue of reinstating the committee meetings. I think we have committee meetings next week, which my recommendation was that we would continue with the Zoom meeting. The county board meeting on the 11th would also be a Zoom meeting, and we would try and go forward with in-person meetings the following week as far as the committees, and then shoot for that second board meeting in June to do something in person, be it in the county boardroom. One of the issues with Memorial Hall is the whole issue of electronics, trying to feed the meeting, also security. So really, if we can do it up in the boardroom, that's probably the best place.
Okay, thanks. And we can follow up on that as well as we go forward. With that, that's what I had this evening. We continue to meet 3 times a week with myself and the mayors on a range of issues. Dr. Martell jumps in on those calls. Those have been productive in terms of getting feedback from folks. One quick thing on the restaurant thing. What was reported back to me is that 50 different individuals somehow connected to restaurants participated in the local discussion, and that did include folks inside and outside of Rockford, and had a good flavor of our overall community. Obviously, there was disappointment in what came down then from the state, that a little bit on the inside dining thing that I do hope we revisit. But with that, that's what I had this evening on the chairman's report. We can move on to announcements and communications. Clerk Gummow.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The items below were received as correspondence.
Okay, we can go ahead and place those on file. Thank you very much, Clerk Gummow. Next item is the consent agenda. No, there is no raffle report, please note that, but there are bills, the approval of the March 26th and April 9th minutes, and April 14th minutes, and the layover of the April 23rd minutes. May I please have a motion to approve the consent agenda, please? Mr. Hoffman, thank you. Mrs. Crosby on the second. Consent agenda is now before the board for discussion. Any questions by board members? Seeing none, are there any board members who are opposed to this motion? Hearing no opposition, I will ask the clerk to cast a yes vote for all members present. Next item on the agenda is the county administrator's report. Steve.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I really have nothing else. Next week and the following weeks will be busy trying to deal with opening up the building and going from there. So thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. Next, is there any department head updates? I know Carlos was with us earlier in the evening. Any department head updates from folks? Seeing none, we'll move on to unfinished business. The unfinished business item this evening is the Chicago Rockford International Airport appointment. It is the Mike Shablasky appointment. And with that, I would entertain a motion to approve. I have a motion to approve by Mr. Booker, a second by Mrs. Crosby. Item is now before the board for discussion. Any discussion by board members?
Mr. Chairman, this is Dorothy Red.
Hi, Mrs. Red, go ahead.
I'm going to ask, I make a motion that be laid over until I receive an apology from Mike Dunn.
We have a motion by Mrs. Red, to lay the item over. I couldn't hear the last part of your statement, Mrs.
Until
Red.
I receive an apology from Mike Dunn.
So you would like the layover of the Mike Shablasky appointment to the airport board to be tied to whether or not you get an apology from Mr. Dunn related to the issue that we've discussed, just so I understand. That's your intention, correct?
That is correct.
Okay. I guess my question becomes, I don't know that we can tie a layover to an action that we don't know if it will happen or not, because my question becomes, what if there is no apology? We just put ourselves in a position where we can never take action on a specific item. So that doesn't seem like an appropriate motion to me.
Mr. Kalenkas, Mr. Kalenkas, can you answer that, please?
Sure. You go ahead, Mr. Kalenkas. Mr. Webster, you're next.
Thank you, Chairman. I think probably the issue that you raised might become one. Generally speaking, when a layover is made, it's not tied to an action that takes place. It's simply laid over to a certain time in the future. Whether it's now, you wouldn't have to lay it over to the next meeting. You could lay it over to a date certain. But I think, I think that it is problematic tying it to an event taking place.
My concern, of course, is that nobody, myself in particular, but nobody that I'm looking at on this Zoom meeting can control if that other piece happens. And since we don't control it, then we're giving up the ability to do business at a time there's an opening on an important board in our region in a discussion that we need to have that is, I think, separate from the issue that has been raised regarding the airport director. So with that, I would ask for a clarification. If Mrs. Red, you would mind making a motion to lay the item over to the next board meeting, if that is your wish, in lieu of until there's an apology, so that we decouple something we can't control with something we can control. I do not hear from Mrs. Red, but I would certainly be happy to give her the floor back if she jumps back on. So my apologies there. I will happily give the floor back to Mrs. Red when she jumps back on here. Mr. Webster, you were up, sir.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I'm just going to second her motion is all. I mean, Dorothy made a motion. I'm going to second that. I'd like to move this along. And so, I hope that Mr. Dunn does step up to the plate and give Dorothy the apology that she so deserves. So at any rate, I will second Dorothy's motion to lay it over. And unless Dorothy comes back on, I would suggest that we lay it over till the next normal board meeting.
So just to pull this apart here so there's no confusion on the board floor, the motion by Mrs. Red is not allowed. And after referring to council, I heard my concern was validated by Mr. Kurlinkus that may be problematic. So then if instead of seconding, since we struck down the motion to lay it over till a potential apology that may or may not ever happen, your motion separate than Mr. Webster would be to make a motion to lay it over to the next board meeting. that would be a motion you're well within your rights to make. Would you like to make that then, sir?
Sure, I'll make that motion. Then we lay this over until the next board meeting. My follow-up comment was that I hope Mr. Dunn does step up to the plate and make that apology. But yes, I would like to lay this over then in the absence of Dorothy coming back online. I think she wanted to lay it over. In fact, I know she wanted to lay it over. So I will make that motion for her to lay it over until the next board meeting.
Okay. So we'll go with Mr. Webster's motion to lay this appointment over to the next board meeting. May I have a second, please? Mr. Gurl on a second. So we have a motion and a second. The motion to lay over to the next board meeting is now before the board for discussion. Since I've heard multiple comments around discussions with something other than the appointment, does anybody want to speak to this layover motion? Yes, sir, Mr. Fellers.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'll speak to this layover. I do not disagree. I disagree with laying this over for another week. I fear this board is conflating a serious personal matter, and that's what, in Mr. Dunn acting as a private citizen, certainly said some very reprehensible things to Mrs. Red, which I think every single one of us, of course, does not condone. I think at the end, though, we have a duty to vote on this board appointment that is 100% independent from personal comments. If this board continues to conflate personal issues and personal attacks with actual county business, it's simply going to make us look like we are holding out for a score to settle. And that's not the kind of impression that we want to give. We need to fill this spot in the board. We need to fill this spot in the board right now, not lay this over, get this done and move on, and then pick this up again in the Personnel and Policies Committee section of this meeting so we can have a real discussion about the comments that were made. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Fellers. I see a couple hands up. Mr. Arena.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I understand the point Mr. Fellers is making, but I don't see Mr. Dunn's action as strictly his own personal opinion. He is executive director of the airport. He was speaking to Mrs. Red regarding an appointment to the board that provides supervision to him. I think just him making that contact is somewhat inappropriate. I don't think he should be influencing who his boss might be, but that's for the airport board to deal with. So I don't think it's strictly a personal issue, and I also think it's appropriate to lay this over because we haven't heard from Mr. Shablaski on his opinion of what Mr. Dunn of Mr. Dunn's actions. Mr. Shablaski is going to be put in the position of a supervisor role over Mr. Dunn, and I think it also a layover would give him the opportunity to weigh in on what happened and how he might deal with it. So for that reason, I'm in favor of the layover. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Any other comments by board members? Mr. Webster.
Yes, thank you, Chairman. There's been a motion and a second. I'll make a motion to call the question, please.
Are you
But
kidding
for
me?
God's sakes, Mr. Webster, let us at least have a conversation.
Hold on.
I'm tired of this. I mean, we've
I've
been
called
doing
the
this for a
question.
year.
The question's been called.
We have a motion to call the question by Mr. Webster, which would end discussion again. Is there a second to this motion?
I will second it.
Mrs. Gorel will second the
I
motion.
will second it also. This is Dorothy Red. I'm back on now. I got kicked off for some reason.
Okay, so we have a second by Mrs. Gorel and Mrs. Red. A motion to call the question, which ends discussion on this matter. With that, a yes vote will end discussion. A no vote will allow discussion on this matter that we have brought up on an agenda 2 other times. Will stay before the board for more discussion. I will ask the clerk to please call the roll. A yes vote calls the question, a no vote continues discussion.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Fellers,
No.
Mr. Fiducia,
Yes.
Mr. Girl,
Yes.
Mrs. Gorel,
Yes.
Mr. Hoffman,
Yes.
Mr. Kelly, Mr. Kelly. Did we lose Mr. Kelly?
Come back, maybe we'll come back to him.
Okay. How about Mr. McDonald?
Yes.
Mr. Neighbors,
Yes.
Mrs. Red,
Yes.
Mr. Salgado,
Yes.
Mr. Schultz,
Yes.
Mr. Tassoni,
Yes.
Mr. Webster,
Yes.
Mr. Westcott, Mr. Westcott. Did we lose Mr. Westcott? Mr. Arena,
Yes.
Mr. Billich. Sorry, I didn't hear it. Mr. Billich,
Sorry, I had it on mute. I'll go with no.
no. Mr. Booker,
Yes.
Mr. Butita,
Yes.
Mrs. Crosby. I think that was a no. One more time for Mr. Kelly. Think we lost Mr. Kelly. One more time for Mr. Westcott.
Clerk Gamal,
Yes.
Mr. Kelly's back on. I see his his face is on here, so he's there. I don't know that he's hearing or he's got muted too. So
Yes, I got disconnected somehow. What are we voting on?
The
Call the
motion,
question.
the motion is a motion by Mr. Webster to call the question to end discussion. A yes vote would end discussion. A no vote would allow discussion to continue.
No.
No.
And Ms. Gummo Crosby votes no.
Thank you, Mrs. Crosby. And again, we've lost Mr. Westcott. So, Mr. Chairman, there are only 4 noes and the remaining yeses on this roll.
We have called the question, which then ends discussion on this item again. And then that would allow you to call the roll on the layover itself. A yes vote would lay this item over to the next board meeting. A no vote would keep it here
Unbelievable.
for a vote this evening. And with that, I will ask the clerk to please call the roll.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Fiducia,
Yes.
Mr. Girl,
Yes.
Mrs. Gorel,
Yes.
Mr. Hoffman,
Yes.
Mr. Kelly,
No. No.
Mr. McDonald. Mr. McDonald, I'm sorry, I didn't hear you.
No.
Thank you. Mr. Neighbors.
Yes.
Yes. Mrs. Red,
Yes.
Mr. Salgado,
Yes.
Mr. Schultz,
Yes.
Mr. Tassoni,
Yes.
Mr. Webster,
Yes.
Mr. Westcott. We still don't have Mr. Westcott. Mr. Arena,
Yes.
Mr. Billich,
Yeah.
Yes.
Mr. Booker,
No.
Mr. Butita,
No.
Mrs. Crosby,
No.
Mr. Fellers,
No.
Mr. Chairman, that's 12 yays, 6 noes, and 1 absent.
Thank you very much. We've laid the item over to the next board meeting. With that, we will go on to our next item on the agenda, which is the Finance Committee. Mr. Salgado.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. There's only one item for the Finance Committee today, which is an ordinance to modify 2019 property tax year late tax penalties, and I so move.
We got a motion by Mr. Salgado on the ordinance to modify the 2019 property tax late tax penalty. May I have a second, please? I have a second by Mr. Arena. Item is now before the board for discussion. Yes, Mr. Girl, then Mr. Arena. Mr. Girl, then Mr. Arena.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I would just see if anyone knows if there's any legislative update from Springfield. There was discussion about the legislature passing tax relief, property tax relief as far as penalties go. Is there any update from the state on that? And I'll ask whoever may have the answer to that.
There was some action taken. They didn't do much down there, but there was a little bit around that, but I'll go to Mr. Arena.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. To answer Mr. Girl's question, they did pass legislation, or the legislature passed it. It hasn't been signed yet, as far as I know, by the governor. What that permits, it said in there that a county board may waive interest and penalties for all taxpayers. It also moves the tax sale from this year into January, I believe. And I had a conversation with Mr. Kurlinkus about it. The fact that it says all in there, if that interferes with what we have proposed and what we're considering tonight, our proposal does not apply to everybody. It applies to people who just demonstrate a hardship. However, what we have before us is authorized under other section of law. And so what we have is still valid even with the existence of this pending legislation. And Mr. Kurlinkus can, follow up on that and correct me if I've misstated any of the facts.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Arena. Mr. Chairman, if I may. Mr. Arena is correct on this, in that it is a permissive, the bill that's passed the General Assembly is a permissive piece of legislation, which means it's not mandatory. So it said, as Mr. Arena said, it says the county board may. However, if the county board does pass a resolution or an ordinance under this new yet to be signed piece of legislation, Mr. Arena is also correct. It must apply to all parcels within the county. You can't just apply it to certain circumstances or anything like that. It would have to apply to all parcels within the county.
Thank you very much. Follow up, Mr. Arena had the floor. Go ahead, Mr. Arena, and then back to Mr. Girl.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So just so everyone understands the thought process behind what we're considering here, we tried to balance the needs of our taxing districts for their revenue with trying to provide some relief to people who are struggling. That's the reason why it doesn't apply to everyone. I think we're aware that many taxpayers have the money already in escrow, and they should be able to pay. We did, it does specify in here that this is for property owners who have not escrowed property tax payments. So that's one thing. Secondly, the individual who's applying for this would have to demonstrate that they attempted to get assistance and were denied. So we're trying to target the people who are, truly affected by the virus. And then we've had repeated conversations with the auditor's office, and they understand. They're going to take the responsibility of vetting these applications and determine who qualifies and who doesn't. And there's some discretion in here for them to be able to, make those decisions. So hopefully we will be able to catch, the majority of people who are going to be struggling because of the situation.
And I'm just restating it, the auditor's office would process these applications. Okay, thank you, Mr. Arena, Mr. Girl.
Thank you, Chairman. I think there's a lot of questions, and maybe the state will do something, but we don't know. I would just like to make a motion to lay this over. I think, it sounds great, but we're only helping out a few people. Even the auditor said there would be very few people that would even qualify. And let's say the people don't qualify and the auditor says they don't qualify. Do they have a legal repercussion to follow after that? I think we're just setting ourselves up for something that we don't really understand. Not that we don't understand, but we just don't understand the full repercussions of this as far as, how many people are going to qualify. And what if someone tried to get unemployment or benefits and they got unemployment or benefits, but it wasn't enough to suffice to actually make a living and to pay the bills? So just to put it out there and just to say that, it's only going to help a few people, I don't think. If we're going to do something, let's help everyone. So
Mr. Girl, I apologize. I'm just going to say this, the motion, let's get your motion and then see if there's a second, and then I'll give you the floor. And then we'll open it up. I apologize. We got a motion by Mr. Girl to lay this over.
Yeah.
Not send it back to committee, lay it over to the next board meeting. Okay, I got it right finally, sorry. A motion by Mr. Girl to lay this over to the next board meeting. Is there a second to the motion? Mr. Hoffman on the second. Motion and a second to lay the item over to the next board meeting. Mr. Girl, I apologize for cutting you off, but I'll give you the floor back. Go ahead.
No worries. Thank you, Chair. I think I said enough, so thank you.
Okay. Then in fairness, I'll go the next hand I see up. I'm going to go back to Mr. Arena because I know he worked on this, and give him the opportunity to clarify or to respond. Mr. Arena.
I just want to make sure it's clear that laying it over is effectively killing it. So there would not be sufficient opportunity for us to act unless we lay it over and then have it apply to everyone. But I think there's going to be resistance to that because it would result in many more late payments. It was the feeling that I got from the conversations we had. So as we vote on this, I think keep that in mind, that laying it over is probably equivalent of just a no vote.
Thank you, Mr. Arena. I see Mrs. Crosby had her hand up. Mrs. Crosby. Go ahead and unmute yourself.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Paul Arena's right. Laying it over is going to kill it. The problem we have is the language is a little bit too loose and not confined enough, and everything he's pointed out is absolutely correct. So how do we remedy this situation? If we lay it over, it dies of natural causes. If we approve it, it doesn't support the things we need to have it support. So I'm going to look to Mr. Arena to amend it to say what it needs to say. Can you do that, Paul?
Well, if you could help me here, how do you want to narrow it down?
Well, the first thing I think we have to look at is the parameters they have for approval, and does it include all classes? If it includes all classes, we're good, but I don't think it does right now.
When you say classes, you're referring to what?
2 families, 4 families, single families.
Oh, no, it includes all properties. So yes.
Correct.
Yeah.
Correct.
Commercial property, any property.
Any property. Any property. It's good.
Any property taxpayer of any property.
Correct. It has to include the whole gamut, or else it is too discriminatory.
No, it includes any property.
Okay.
So I think actually its most effect is going to be on like business properties, because say an owner of a 2-family, I guess if it's their personal residence, maybe it would apply, but if it's a rental property, they probably have the money. They weren't affected. We're not seeing a big effect of the COVID on rental property owners, but we are seeing it on small business owners. So say a small business that's located, that owns the property where their business is located, those would be the primary type of people that I see this helping.
I concur. So we need to include that in the motion.
But I believe those properties are here, that it does apply to those people.
So where is the rub?
Well, I think Mr. Girls was suggesting possibly that it should apply to everyone and not just the people that had sought assistance, which is a legitimate point for us to debate. And I'm not necessarily opposed to that, but I can report to all of you that there was concerns among people within the county of how this is going to affect our tax collections, and that there's taxing districts that are under financial pressure right now. So the idea was trying to strike a balance. I'd rather help more people than less, my own personal opinion.
Well, I'm gonna support Bert Girl in saying that we need to help the most spectrum of any individuals that are being impacted by COVID-19. And even though the tax dollars may be under stress, we still need to help those guys because they cannot help themselves at this point. Bert, you want to lay in?
Well, hold on 1 second. We're going to pick that back up. Thank you, Mrs. Crosby. Thank you, Mr. Arena. I got Mr. Fellers. Then we're going to go back to Mr. Girl. Mr. Fellers.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I would just say that laying this over would likely sort of be its death. I would suggest that ask maybe Mr. Girl if he would withdraw his motion to lay it over and instead make a motion to send this back to committee for further debate and review, so a smaller group can figure out the right way to get this done, rather than trying to do this board floor. You never know when someone's going to call the question.
True.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Fellers. Actually, I'm going to go to Mr. Hoffman, then Mr. Girl. Mr. Hoffman, the first time before Mr. Girl, a second.
Mine be quick. I'm going to withdraw my second.
So we're withdrawing our second. So okay, so what happens when we withdraw a second? There's no motion then, or
There's someone else that wants a second?
Can I rephrase my motion?
Yes, sir. Mr. Girl.
Okay. I would like to see this lay over, maybe if it goes back to committee, I'll make the motion to send it back to committee, but I would also like to see language in this that retroactive puts it back into the place. So if this stretches out maybe 2 weeks, that people would be covered on this first installment that would need to be covered. So we can make the action, but we can retro it. And if we have to send payments out that people may have overpaid, whatever it may be, but let's do it right the first time. Let's just do a retroactive. So I'll make my motion to send this back to committee for further discussion.
And just to be, okay, we got a motion. Let me clarify, which committee is it going back to?
Finance.
Finance. Okay, so there's a motion to send it back to Finance Committee, a second by Mrs. Crosby and Mr. Fellers. The new amended motion is to send it back to Finance Committee. Yes, Mr. Arena.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So my question then would be, and I see where everyone's going with this, and I understand it's a complex issue. So the tax bills are due June 19th. Our next regular scheduled meeting, I believe, is June 11th. So that would put us kind of against the wall for people to apply for it in advance of their payment being due. So I guess I'd like to, ask Mr. Chapman and Mr. Kurlinkus, if we do this, if we send it back to committee and it comes back to the floor on the 11th, would we still be able to adopt something that's functional, given the time constraint?
I'm seeing a no. Then the question I have as a follow-up is if the Finance Committee was willing to have a meeting and we had a special board meeting to follow, and I'm not saying this is where to go, but I would just say if there's some accommodation that could be made, if this is what happens, because this is a much different direction, much more expansive. And before you go that expansive on an amendment on the board floor, I don't know the ramifications of it, and I'm sure other people don't as well. If there's a move to send it back to finance, then we could always join that with a special meeting and move that action item before the 11th of June. If the board, if that is a direction you all want to go, I'm flexible, but it's whatever you guys want to do. Mr. Salgado.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I think the issue that we would have is because there's a partial payment that needs to be made in order for that, and that's referring to the first payment. That's the issue that we have here, and it's a time-sensitive piece. We discussed about this when we first brought the idea, and we answered the questions. We sent out a press release asking the taxing bodies to respond. I will give you my commentary that Mr. Arena can jump in at any time. The only individual from would say taxing body was St. Angel, Jasper St. Angel, responded saying that it didn't go enough further down the line. And that was been the consensus from some citizens that actually expressed, that it doesn't go in depth. We had debate, the guidelines, trying to figure out how can we address these issues and making sure that we are collecting our revenue as much as possible. And, we had those discussions. So I'm just, from my standpoint, it's right on the cusp of June 19th. We either do it now or we delay it and, lay it over as Mr. Girl has suggested, and maybe apply it for the second payment of some sort. We kind of have a groundwork for that, but it's the decision on how the board wants to proceed. We addressed this with Mr. Arena, this discussion about the time sensitivity and the manpower that went with this as well. So I'm just saying that if we do send it back to committee, not a problem. We can address it, but it's most likely going to have to be for the second payment on that, because the ordinance, the way it's set up is there has to be a partial payment made as part of it. And Mr. Kurlinkus can correct me on that, or Mr. Arena can jump on that. But that's my takeaway from this.
So if the board didn't take action tonight and it took action Monday night, does that in any way assist the board? Does that throw a monkey wrench into what was the plan going into this evening? I'm not saying that's what you want to do.
The time frame and the getting it available, the applications, the process of who qualifies, who doesn't qualify, that sort. So it just shortens the window for that. So Mr. Kurlinkus, I don't know if you want to jump in and answer that question.
Go ahead, Dave.
Thank you, Chairman. What Mr. Salgado said is very, very accurate on this. The way, if you take a look at the application that was sent out with the copy of the draft ordinance here, it was contemplated that the partial payment would be made on the 12th of June, which is just a week before the entire payment, the first installment would be due. I don't know what type of discussion or what type of expansion it's, because I think that's what it sounds like. There's a potential expansion of the coverage that this ordinance would do. I think part of the problem that we went over, and I think this is what Mr. Arena ran into when we put that press release out, is getting information out to the public at large. And I do believe, and Steve Chapman could jump in on this. I mean, I think it's going to impact these taxing districts that are going to be not expecting this at all. But again, that's up to the board. But it is time sensitive. I would agree with that 100%. And you're running up against it when you go to the first meeting in June.
Thank you very much, Mr. Kurlinkis. Mrs. Crosby, then Mr. Billick, then Mr. Arena. Mrs. Crosby.
Okay, here's how I look at this. If we extend the installment to 6/30 or a total of month later, 7/20 or 7/12, it doesn't, I mean, a 30-day extension doesn't impact the county that much. It'll impact them a little bit, but not a whole lot. So I'm going to go with, we can probably extend that to 6/30 and be fine.
No,
I do know there's some people that want to jump back in.
Go ahead.
Let me clarify this before I go to Mr. Billick, just so we tie the loop and get clarity on this. Steve, is there anything you wanted to add to that comment, just regarding timing and cadence here?
Well, I think in terms of the timing, normally if the treasurer collects taxes through the 19th, those taxes would be distributed to the taxing districts before the June 30th. A lot of the school districts like their taxes received before that date so they can incorporate them into their fiscal year. I know the fire protection districts, et cetera, they're looking for their taxes also. So I think moving that tax date back is going to be problematic for these taxing districts that are, in essence, waiting for those tax dollars to pay their bills, including the county.
Mr. Billick.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Actually, I would like, if I may, I'd like to yield a couple minutes to Jaime so he can actually make a clarification real quick, and then I'd like to get back up there if I can.
Yeah, the clarification is to the question about it does affect the taxing bodies, and I believe Mr. Kurlinkis can jump in here. It's state statute that we have to enforce these. I believe last year the only reason why the second payment was actually a week later, 2 weeks later, was because they were late in mailing the tax payments or whatever for the taxes. I believe that's the reason, but Mr. Kurlinkis can jump in, but it does affect the tax bodies if we decide 6/30 or July or whatever the case may be for the first payment on that aspect of it.
Go ahead, Dave.
And to get back to my thing, thank you, Jaime, for making that clarification. And to get back to this, Jaime, thank you for working really hard on this. Now, I've kind of read through it a little bit. I might have missed a little bit of the other points, but I wanted to put my opinion out there in regards to, there are people that are waiting to find out exact answers to this and what we're doing with this. There's a lot of people that are dependent on the fact that we could do more to help them out during this impact crisis. Now, from my understanding, this is not saying that they don't have to pay taxes at all. It's just resolving at least the late payments, at least for a little bit, and forgiving them on that end of it. We as a county and many municipalities do not bank on the extra money that they would make from late payments. They bank on the fact that people are going to pay their taxes. So the faster we can get this through, the faster I think it will actually help a lot of people plan out what they can do and what they can afford, as well as the municipalities will know that they are going to be getting their cuts of whatever the tax allotment is, and to make sure that they know what their funding is going to look like over the next few months. We don't want to restricting a few things. I understand that we want to look at the full dynamics of it, and I understand that, and I can respect that 100%. What I want to make sure that we're also doing is protecting our municipalities and our municipal partners, as well as all their taxing bodies. And at the same time, while also making sure at forefront that we are giving the best work ethic towards our communities that we are actually here to represent. I just want to say that. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Billick. Any other, I don't see any other, Mrs. Crosby, or I'm sorry, no, Mr. Arena, then Mrs. Crosby. Mr. Arena.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. One thing I should have pointed out earlier, if you're looking at this in your packet, the version that passed out of finance was version 1. And there's some highlighted language in there that we discussed possibly removing. Version 2 would have removed that highlighted language. And that language in particular gives a little bit of latitude to the auditor when they're making a determination. And then secondly, I understand Mr. Billich just made the point about talking about the money goes to the taxing district. This interest and penalties we're talking about is money that goes into our general fund. I believe that's correct. Mr. Chapman can correct me if I'm wrong. So you understand the numbers. I was told that in a typical year, approximately 12,000 taxpayers pay that first payment late. And those people pay in approximately $700,000 in total in fees and penalties is what ends up being collected. What we tried to do here is incentivize people who may be choosing to pay to defer paying their entire payment to instead pay part of it, so it would reduce the amount of penalties, or actually relieve them of penalties and increase the amount of revenue coming in. That's why it's structured the way it is. So my sense from this conversation is we're talking essentially about considering maybe having it apply to everyone, and therefore there would be no penalties if everyone pays a quarter of it. Some people who pay none would still pay penalties. If you don't pay your second payment, then the penalties would apply retroactively. That's something else I need to point out. I just wanted you all to understand those facts as you consider how we should best move forward. I know those of us working with the Finance Committee tried to hash out a lot of these same issues. What we came up here, we thought was the best compromise. I just wanted you all to be aware of those issues and facts. Thank you.
Mr. Chairman.
Yes, hold on, Mrs. Gorel. I got you second. I got Mr. McDonald, then you, Mrs. Gorel. Mr. McDonald.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I know that I've said it before. The Fire Protection District, Northwest Fire, West Suburban, Sherland, Durand. We're talking about fire protection districts with budgets less than $25,000 a year. So a little delay, that really legitimately could come down to them not being able to put fuel in their fire engine. They can't do an oil change in their engine. They cut it that close. I think we need to get them some answers as well. If we do end up moving to where you don't have to pay for a while, we need to think about what we can do to help these people out so they can make sure to provide essential services, especially right now during this time.
Thank you, Mr. McDonald. And Mrs. Gorel, then Mrs. Crosby. Mrs. Gorel.
Thank you, Chairman. Paul's put a lot of work into this. He's done a lot of research on it. Our finance department has gone and done a lot of research and have put a lot of work into this. And I think they've done the best, and we really should go with them. We can nickel and dime this all night long, and all we're doing is prolonging what should be done today. If Steve's the one who always says we're kicking the can down the street. We can't do that this time. There's too many things involved with people. If we find that this isn't working, we can stop it after or amend it for the fall. But at this time, we really need to vote on it and keep within the dates and thank these gentlemen for doing the best they can do, and they've done their research. So I'm going to vote for it the way it is. I'm not going to vote to delay this over. Thank you.
The motion is to lay it over. Yes vote lays it over. A no vote keeps it here for action this evening. Mr. Girl. No, I'm sorry, Mrs. Crosby, then Mr. Girl. Sorry.
Thank you,
Mrs.
Chairman.
Crosby.
Thank you. You know, people are lining up for food and they think those facing a hardship can afford 25% payment in such a quick turnaround, and that's very concerning. So I'm opposed to laying it over. I want to see it get done tonight and support those that are incredibly in need from our county and need the right vote. Thank you.
Okay, I'm going to correct what I just said. The motion that was corrected was to send to Finance Committee. That's the motion in the second. So if there's an affirmative vote, we would send it to the Finance Committee. My apologies. Mr. Girl.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just one quick question, and maybe Mr. Arena can answer this, but are we going to mail out some kind of notice application to every single homeowner, or just the people that you think that may qualify? And that's the question, Mr. Arena. Then I have one more after that.
The application.
Go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The application, I had talked to Mr. Gettner about having it available online for people to either fill out online and apply or download. Mr. Gettner informed me that that's not a difficult thing for them to do and they could do with a quick turnaround. There is in the packet a copy of the application that we would be using and that the Mr. Crowley has been over. So we're not going to be mailing anything else out. The tax bills have already been mailed and have probably been received by everyone. So this would be something that we have to communicate through the media and through our website at this point.
Okay, and that was kind of my follow-up was, how are we going to get this information out to the voters, or I'm sorry, the homeowners that maybe don't have social media, maybe don't have internet, if maybe they don't watch the news? Then what do we do if they don't know that they could possibly qualify? And are we really doing a service to everybody, or just the folks that, you know, have internet access, that maybe watch the news? But I think everyone needs to be notified that there is this opportunity if you qualify. So how do we do that? Yeah, that's my question.
Mr. Chairman, if I may.
Yeah, go ahead, Mr. Salgado.
Yeah, so Bert, that's a very good question. I mean, we talked about this in the Finance Committee with Mr. Arena and the time, you know, between the first payment. That's all been discussed. It's an issue. We understand. At this point in time, the best methodology that we could do is press release, media, put it on the website, send it to our partners to share it with their clients that potentially are going through hardship with this COVID. That's the only form right now with our time frame. Now, if we had until say August, yeah, it wouldn't be a big deal. We could do more of, you know, whether it's a mailing or some sort that we can absorb that cost. Absolutely, we could do that. But right now we're in a crunch. Those are things that, you know, the finance committee took into account with Mr. Arena's idea and suggestion, hard work, and working with Mr. Kerlinkis and the auditor and Lori Gamau herself on trying to take the applications and the process. Do we have a process in place? How do we not discriminate, make sure that we get as much people as we possibly can, so we don't take advantage of this situation, and taxing bodies get their money. We don't delay the payments. That's all been thought of. And so committing to a percentage for the first payment encourages those monies going into those taxing bodies. As we expected, 12,000 people typically file that don't pay on the first, and they don't receive that money. And so we're trying to encourage, but also be supportive as much as we can. Like I said, if we want to do second payment and not the first payment, whatever the case, we got more time. That's something that the finance can move. But I really think if we really want to do something right now, we move forward on this direction. We can fine tune it if we want to apply it for the second payment, whatever direction we want to move into. like I said, we've sent the press release out. Our partners, the only ones that I saw that I came in and I forwarded to Mr. Arena as he was working with the draft with Mr. Kerlinkus, were citizens that were saying it's not going to be enough for me, or it's not going to be enough, whatever the case may be, on this aspect of it. But we did lay out the different types of things, how you qualify, what disqualifies you, what percentage goes in. So we ensure that the taxing bodies are not going to get hit with that as well, but also provide some sort of relief for the county as a whole. So that's just to answer your question. I don't think it's just the time sensitivity piece of it, from my perspective, and that's what I kind of addressed. And Mr. Arena can jump in if he wants.
Anyone else before I go back to Mr. Arena or Mr. Girl?
Just real quick,
Hold
Chairman, if I
on
could.
I'm sorry. Hold on 1 second here. Oh, sorry about that, Mr. Girl.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I would like to withdraw my motion to send it back to committee. It sounds like the time sensitivity and everything around this needs to happen tonight. So I'll withdraw that motion and wish to vote on this evening.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Girl. We've withdrawn a motion, so that brings us back to home base. The original motion was to approve this item on the finance agenda, the ordinance to modify the 2019 property tax late tax penalties. Mr. Arena.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I just want to say, I understand the concerns that Mr. Girl raised about communicating this. It's something we thought about. If I had my preference, we would just waive penalties for everybody. That's what I wish we could do. But through a lot of conversation, it was decided that, if you did that, people who could pay then would take advantage of the opportunity and not pay all and just pay the quarter of it. And that was going to have, the type of effect that Mr. McDonald raised as a concern. And, this was, I would say this is imperfect, right? All of us can look at it and say, I wish it could be different in some way or another. We worked through many scenarios, and this unfortunately was the best we could come up with. And like I said, if we could afford to just waive them for everyone, that's what I wish we could do, but we just couldn't make that work. So as you vote on it, I guess, keep that in your mind. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Arena. Thank you, Mr. Girl, and others for a lively discussion. We are back to the original motion, which is to approve the ordinance to modify 2019 property tax year late penalties. Any other discussion by board members? Okay. With that, are there any board members who are opposed to this motion? Please raise your hand. I see Mr. Schultz as a no vote. I do not see any or hear any other board members dissenting. So then we will cast a yes vote for all other members present. We have passed this finance item. Thank you very much for a good discussion. Mr. Salgado.
Thank you very much. I do like the conversation that we're having on this. But I also want to appreciate Mr. Arena, Mr. Kerlinkus, Mr. Chapman, and the auditor's office, the clerk's office, on this and taking this endeavor. So I just want to thank them for all their hard work. We'll get the application as soon as possible, get the process going. So make sure that it gets out to the public and it reaches the masses as much as we can. One other item, I know that Steve and I and the Finance Committee have been meeting and talking about essentially where we're at, the projections. I'm hoping that more conversation will occur for 2020 where we're at, and based on our policy of the 25%. So more discussion will be brought up on that. It was alluded, I believe, Mr. Chapman, 22%, 23% is where we would project at the end of 2020 fiscal cycle, which would be 2%, give or take. under that threshold of our policy of 25%. So discussion will be held on that. I just wanted to update the board on that. We're having discussions about that, not only about that, but also looking into 2021. So a lot of things going on that. More to come, information. And Mr.
I got it.
Has a question. Yep.
Yes. Hold on. Thank you, Mr. Salgado. Mr. Kurlikas.
Thank you, Chairman. I just wanted to say that Mr. Salgado is very effusive in his praise of our office too, but Paul Carpenter also contributed greatly to this too, so I'd just like him recognized also.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Dave. Any other questions by board members?
That concludes our report.
Thank you very much, Mr. Salgado. Mr. Webster, Zoning Committee.
We have nothing. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Webster. Mr. Billick, Economic Development.
We have nothing to report.
Thank you very much, Mr. Billick. Operations Administrative Committee, Mr. McDonald.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The Operations Committee has no report for this evening, but I would like to mention that we're going to set up a housing subcommittee. We're going to take a look at things like the land bank and other housing issues around the county. I think Mr. Arena is going to chair that. I know he shared with me that he has 2 other members of the board that are interested in that. So I would just urge anybody to that would have an interest in a housing subcommittee to get a hold of Mr. Arena and get this thing started. That is all. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. McDonald. Next item of business, Public Works Committee. Mr. Tassoni.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. This evening, your Public Works Committee brings forth 3 resolutions. The first item would be 20-019. It's a resolution authorizing the award of bid for the second 2020 county general letting. And this just has to do with a few items that were left out of the resolution, maybe upwards of a month ago, that didn't make it on the bid tab. And they're just general annual housekeeping items and materials and things that we use on an annual basis. I would so move.
I'll second that.
We have a motion by Mr. Tassoni on the resolution authorizing the award to bid the second 2020 county general letting. We have a second by Mr. Webster. Any discussion by board members? Seeing none, are there any board members who are opposed to this motion? I do not hear or see any objection, so I will ask the clerk to cast a yes vote for all members present. Mr. Tassoni.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The next item would be resolution 20-020. And it's a resolution authorizing or awarding quotes for the supply of electricity for our county traffic signals and the highway lighting. I would so move and speak to it as well.
We got a motion by Mr. Tassoni on the resolution awarding quotes for supplying electricity for traffic signals and highway lighting. And note the rate to be locked in on May 28th. May I have a second, please? Second by Mr. Kelly. Thank you. And Mr. Hoffman, thank you. Item is now before the board. I'll go to Mr. Tassoni.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And regarding electricity rates, this was something that was just at least guaranteed or put in writing as of yesterday or today, I believe. And we could do a 1, 2, or a 3-year contract. There's a few $100 savings versus a 1, 2, and 3-year contract. This is approximately a $4,000 a year savings from our last quote. And like I say, with your Public Works Committee is recommending a 3-year contract.
3-year contract. Okay, thank you very much. Again, we have that motion. A second item is before the board on supplying electricity to traffic signals and highway lighting. Any discussion by board members on this? The 3-year option is what is coming from the Public Works Committee. Seeing none, are there any board members who are opposed to this motion? I hear and see no objection, so I will ask the clerk to cast a yes vote for all members present. Thank you very much, Mr. Tassoni.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Our third and final resolution is resolution 20-021. It's a resolution authorizing the execution of a construction inspection guidance agreement with Fair Graham and the appropriation of MFT funds for the purpose of assisting county staff for construction inspection of, this would be widening and resurfacing on our Baxter Road project. I would so move and speak to it as well.
Yes, we got a motion by Mr. Tassoni on item 4, resolution authorizing execution of construction inspection guidance, assisting county staff. May I have a second, please? May I have a second? Mr. Kelly, Mr. Billick, and Mr. Salgado, thank you. Item is now before the board for discussion. Mr. Tassoni, anything you care to add?
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I'll just speak for it a moment here and then turn it over to Mr. Molina if he'd like to add to it. But typically, this is, we're looking at maybe $150,000 cost for this service and inspection. Typically, it would be upwards of a few $100,000, if not more, for the same scope of work. And I believe the EDP funds are half of it. In the Winnebago County portion of it, I believe we would reimburse our, at least county staff, out of the motor fuel tax. And if Mr. Molina would like to add to that.
Thank you.
Yeah,
Mr.
Carlos,
Chairman.
go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Yeah, this is to assist our personnel on construction inspection. Basically, they they do testing at the plant. They do testing on field. They have equipment that we do not have here, and with some of the other work that we have, we just don't have enough staff to do this. As you can see, it's a $150,000 contract. Typically, if they were to do inspection, it would be about $300,000 for this type of project. And as part of this resolution, you're also appropriating $300,000 from the MFT fund, so that we can, besides the consultant, $150,000, we would also be able to charge our time to this project to the MFT account.
Thank you very much, Carlos. I saw Mr. Kelly had his hand up. Go ahead and unmute yourself, Mr. Kelly, and you're up.
Carlos already covered it.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Mr. Kelly. Any other discussion by board members? I do not see any hands up. Are there any board members that are opposed to this motion? Seeing and hearing no opposition, I will ask the clerk to cast a yes vote. For all members present, motion passes unanimously. Mr. Tassoni.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And that concludes our Public Works report, but additional item I would like to say, at least to Mrs. Gummow, I will not be in attendance for the rest of this portion of the meeting. And I just apologize to my colleagues that I have something to have to attend to. And I would just say good evening and good luck and stay safe.
Thank you, Mr. Tassoni.
Thank you.
Public Safety Committee, Mr. Booker.
Thank you, Chairman. Public Safety Committee brings one item to the board, and it is a resolution extending the intergovernmental cooperation agreement with the Winnebago County Sheriff's Department for Police Services with the Village of McChesney Park, extending it to June 30th, 2020. And I move for its adoption.
Got a motion by Mr. Booker on the resolution extending the IGA cooperation agreement for police services with the village.
Second.
30th. We have a second by Mrs. Crosby and Mrs. Gorel. Item is now before the board for discussion. Basically, we've extended it one time. Now we're extending it a second time, presumably to give more time for this to come to a head. Is that correct, Mr. Booker?
Yes, Chairman, that's correct. McChesney Park, we've submitted it. Mr. Kalinkas has informed me, but McChesney Park has yet to respond.
Excuse me.
There
Yes,
we
Mr. Dave, go ahead.
Yeah, thank you, Chairman. We did get the red line version back from the attorney for McChesney Park yesterday. So I am looking through the red lines.
Okay. Nevertheless, if we do take the action, it allows for us to do something before June 30th, if you so choose, and if we're ready, but we would have up until June 30th. Is that correct?
Yeah, the extension would at a maximum go to the end of June.
Not to exceed. Thank you very much, Dave. And Mr. Booker, anything else to add?
Thank you, Mr. Kalinkas. That's good to hear that you've received something. So One other item, unless there's any more discussion on the IGA.
Let's take the vote real quick here. Is there any opposition to this motion? Hearing and seeing no opposition, I will ask Clerk Gummow to cast a yes vote for all members present. Motion passes unanimously. Mr. Booker.
Thank you, Chairman. I just wanted to report that the county jail has one inmate in the county jail with COVID, and he is in isolation, and there are 0 corrections officers with COVID. Everybody's healthy. That concludes my report.
Yeah.
Thank you very much, Mr. Booker. I might add one thing for your consideration, and just since I have you, I'll mention it. Today, there was some email exchange with the sheriff and the chief deputy regarding some public safety updates. We're getting daily, weekly, we're getting a lot of public health updates. Obviously, we're in the middle of a pandemic, but if we could see corresponding public safety updates, obviously those are different data points. The sheriff very quickly and responsively got back, said, hey, they'll work something up. But with your okay, that maybe when you have a discussion or have your next meeting, have that presented at your committee if that's something you want to do.
Right. Yes, Chairman, that's correct. I did see the email on that, and it was like a comparable type of report that other counties are implementing as far as how COVID or the pandemic is affecting our police services, reports of calls and such. Again, it's a crisis other than that's creating other problems other than the virus itself. So, yeah, I did see that, and we'll have something put together for the next committee meeting.
Okay, I'll leave it with you. And it was, I think DuPage County did a nice job on that data set right there. So, okay, thank you very much. Mrs. Gorel, go ahead.
I would like to also, Mr. Booker, if you can get an update with juvenile detention too and see how that's going with it. Thank you.
That's correct. Thank you, Mrs. Gorel.
Thank you very much, Ms. Gorel and Mr. Booker. Next item of business is, I believe that concludes Mr. Booker's report. Is that correct? Yes. So then we'll go to Personnel and Policy Committee, Mr. Fiducia.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Your Personnel and Policies Committee has 3 resolutions this evening. The first resolution is a resolution affixing compensation and other benefits for certain elected officials, and I so move.
We got a motion by Mr. Fiducia on the resolution regarding compensation for certain elected officials. I may have a second by Mrs. Gorel. Thank you. Item is now before the board for discussion. Mr. Westcott, you had your hand up. Unmute yourself, sir.
I was going for the same motion.
Okay, so we'll add Mr. Westcott as a second as well. Any discussion on the motion regarding elected official compensation? Mr. Fiducia, do you want to note any? Oh, go ahead, Mr. Girl.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I would just like to abstain from this vote.
We're going to note for the record, Clerk Gummow, Mr. Girl will not be voting. Mr. Fiducia, is there any, do you want to read for the record any items you guys highlighted salary-wise or compensation-wise? I know you had a lengthy discussion.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I believe everything stayed the same except for the vehicle for the oncoming chairman. I don't believe they included that. And Mr. Chapman could probably correct me if there's anything else I missed.
Okay, I see Steve nodding in agreement. So the only change was to the chairman vehicle for the record. Item is before the board for discussion. Mr. Butita.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Given our current financial situation, I can't vote in favor of any increase for any employee at this time. Thank you.
Noted. And can we, for the record, just since that's been brought up, the increases to certain, not certain elected officials as the whole, but certain, the subgroup of that group got increases. Could either Steve or Mr. Fiducia just read that in for the record?
I'd ask Mr. Chapman to read that into the record.
Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Steve?
Sure. in terms of the county auditor, his previous salary was $81,284. This takes it up to $87,000. It stays the same for the following year, 87, and then he would receive a cost of living increase based on the 87,000. The county coroner, let's see here. His current salary is $88,176. It would go up to $92,765 plus a vehicle, which he's that position has had over the last 8 years. The second year would also be the $92,765, and then the third and fourth year would be inflationary increases. The county board chairman, the salary stays the same for the first 2 years. And then with the deletion of the vehicle, and then third and fourth years, it would just be a cost of living increase.
Thank you very much, Steve. Any other comments or questions by board members? Mr. Arena.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I had some conversations about this, and I understand Mr. Butita's point and tend to agree with it. But Mr. Chapman, correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe the auditor hadn't had an increase in that position over the last 8 years. And if we didn't take action now at all, the position would stay, the pay would stay the same for the next 4. I'm not sure if the coroner had gone as long without any increase at all, but I think in any organization for a person to go for 12 years without any adjustment in their compensation is quite a long time. So, you know, I understand our financial situation. I think we just need to kind of look at it in terms of the big picture. It's unfortunate that it's happening at this moment in time, but we're somewhat, our hands are tied because of, you know, we have to do it now for the next 4 years. Am I wrong in those timeframes, Mr. Chapman, on how long it's been since these positions had increases?
Mr. Chairman, the auditor and the coroner, their salary was frozen for the last 4 years. Prior to that, the previous 4 years, the increases they received were about 0.6%. So over the 4 years, I think it was overall increase of 2.4%, 0.6% each year. The chairman's position, I believe, was frozen for these last 4 years also.
I will take Mr. Butita's comment that he made just as a comment for the record. And I'm assuming that was not a motion. It was just a comment about where your position is. And I'm seeing a yes, the nod heading yes. So we'll leave it at that. Thank you, Mr. Arena. Thank you, Steve. Any other comments on the elected official salary discussion? Seeing none, are there any board members who are opposed to the motion before them related to elected official salaries? I'm going to cast a yes vote, or excuse me, a no vote for Mr. Butita and an abstention from Mr. Girl and a no vote for Mrs. Crosby. And then we're going to cast a yes vote for all other members present. Motion passes. Thank you very much, Mr. Fiducia.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The next is a resolution authorizing the chairman of the county board to execute an agreement with Government Temps USA LLC for the employment of interim county administrator Steve Chapman, and I so move.
Yeah, we have a motion by Mr. Fiducia on the extension of, or the agreement regarding the GovTemp USA employment of interim county administrator. A second by Mrs. Crosby, Mr. Kelly, and Mr. Girl. Item is now before the board. The extension is from now until when, just for the record, Mr. Fiducia?
I believe it's into July, if I'm not mistaken, Mr. Chapman.
Steve?
Yes, it's. I believe it's a 2-month extension from June 5th, with another possible extension. Hopefully not until October 5th. The it also allows for a 2-week notice if the county so chooses, and give 2 weeks notice and the contract is terminated.
So if I could just follow that up, I have no issue with this, very supportive of it, but does it make sense, since it's very logical and possible that, you know, all or some of us will be going back to Steve and saying, we're in the middle of the budget cycle, with or without a new county administrator that is transitioning in, you know, we hate to lose you in the middle of that cycle, which is like 2 months from now, is hot and heavy. That would seem to me to be, if there's a perfect or worst time to lose somebody like Steve, it would be then. Do you want to give yourself latitude a little further out? I don't care. I'm just raising a question that I'm sure is on other people's minds as well. Maybe no one else has that question, but I
do.
Budget cycles go. Seeing none, the item, Steve, go ahead.
Yeah, as I said, there is a 2-month extension in the agreement if we, you know, so choose to carry it forward to October. So that's already incorporated into the agreement.
My mistake. So it could be verbally, it could be extended without any additional board action. Is that what I'm understanding?
I believe so, yes.
Okay, that changes my comment altogether. It gives you the latitude. Mrs. Crosby.
You know, here's where I'm at. Personnel and Policies received the resignation of Carla Pichelle in July of 19. We're coming up on June of 19, and we haven't even gotten to the point where we're looking at candidates. So I'm admonishing Personnel and Policies for failure to do the work that they've been called to do. I want to see productivity. I want to see results. I want to see accomplishment. And 11 months later, we have nothing. So I hope you get off your rear ends and decide to do what is right for the county and then hire an administrator. Because after all this time, you would think that you have been able to do this before now, and you haven't been able to accomplish it. I don't fault Paul Arena for the good work he's done, but I do fault Personnel and Policies for not carrying the water for the county that they should have. End of my comments.
Thank you, Mrs. Crosby. Mr. Arena.
I know all of us are eager to get a new administrator in place, and I apologize if I didn't. I thought I had reported to the full board that Workplace had begun interviewing the pool of candidates that they felt were viable, and they did do that, and now they have it pared down to 3 top candidates, and we are going to conduct in-person interviews hopefully within the next week. That will be the ad hoc committee will sit in on the observe. So our goal is, you know, by the end of June to have a replacement selected. So I must not have made that statement earlier. The new development is that we're down to 3, and that hopefully we'll have a selection here shortly. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. The item before the board specific is the extension of the GovTemps USA, basically the extension of Steve's working agreement specific to that. And we can come back to the other piece. I think that's worth a little bit of discussion under new business, because that's obviously important. Is there anything specific to the approval of this item related to GovTemp USA? No, I see none. Are there any board members who are opposed to this motion? I do not see any objection or hear any objection, so I will ask Clerk Gumow to cast a yes vote for all members that are present. Thank you very much. Motion passes. And we're just going to make a quick note that after this next item of personnel policy, we'll give Mr. Arena back the floor just for a quick thing. So everybody, before they leave, I believe this came up in the Democrat caucus, the search on the administrator. So that way we leave tonight with a baseline information. So motion passes. We've extended Steve's working arrangement. And I will give the floor back to Mr. Fiducia.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The last resolution is a resolution regarding the communication with the Chicago Rockford International Airport Board Chairman, and I so move.
We got a motion by Mr. Fiducia on the regarding the communication with the airport director. May I have a second, please? I have a second, Mr. Arena, Mr. Webster, and Mrs. Worrell. So the item is now before the board for discussion. Any discussion by board members on this, the resolution, which includes the letter? I do believe Steve sent that to the entire board. I do believe it was also sent out earlier, to the best of my knowledge. And there was some discussion in committee, not to steal anybody's thunder, that the letter is addressed to the airport board chairman, Paul Cicero, CC the rest of the board, and to the airport director. That is the only substantive change between, I think, what was a first draft and a second, from the best that I can tell. Any discussion by board members on this resolution? Yes, sir, Mr. Westcott.
Yes, I won't be happy until I see Mr. Dunn show up and apologize to Mrs. Red for his actions. And I would also like to see him removed from the airport board, even though I know that isn't ever going to happen. But it's something that I feel is needed. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Westcott. Any other discussion by board members? Yes, sir, Mr. Webster.
I agree with Mr. Westcott 100%. Thank you, Fred.
Any other discussion by board members? Whoever has their background TV on, could they mute it? Thank you. Okay, with that, I will ask Clerk Gummow to please call the roll. A yes vote would pass the resolution, which includes the letter, and no vote would deny it. Clerk Gummow.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Gurl,
Yes.
Mrs. Gorel,
Yes.
Mr. Hoffman,
Yes.
Mr. Kelly,
Yes.
Mr. McDonald,
Yes.
Mr. Neighbors,
Yes.
Mrs. Red,
Yes.
Mr. Salgado,
Yes.
Mr. Schultz,
Yes.
Mr. Tassoni,
Absent.
Do you mean abstain?
No, Mr.
no,
Tassoni
Mr.
left the
Tassoni
meeting.
left the meeting. That is correct.
Apologies.
Mr. Webster,
Yes.
Mr. Westcott,
Yes.
Mr. Arena,
Yes.
Mr. Billich,
No.
Mr. Booker,
Yes.
Mr. Butita,
I'll abstain.
Mr. Crosby,
No.
Mr. Fellers.
Yes.
One abstention, one absent, 2 nays.
And Mr. Fiducia is a yes also.
I have a question.
Hold on,
How
Mrs.
can
Red.
Mr.
Hold on, Mrs. Red, just 1 second, please. If I could get a vote tally.
Okay, so that would be 15 yes, 2 noes, 1 absent, and 1 abstention.
Okay, motion passes. Thank you very much. Mrs. Red, I apologize. Go ahead.
Why is Mr. Butita abstaining?
Oh, man.
Hello?
Hello?
Yes,
Why is
Mrs. Red, go ahead.
Why is Mr. Butita abstaining?
Mr. Butita.
All right. Okay, this is very personal for me, but I think this whole process is not benefiting our community. So I'm going to leave it at that. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr.
I don't think he can do that because
Mrs.
a
Red.
year or so, I don't think he can abstain because a year or so ago when Mr. Christensen was in there, they stopped that.
Yeah, Mrs. Red, I will allow that. I will allow him to abstain on that, but thank you very much for your comments. With that, the motion has passed, and we will move forward to new business.
Point of order.
Yes, Mr. Schultz.
I'd like to get a ruling on that from Mr. Kalinkas, please.
Chairman, it's up to you. Do you want me to?
No, you're free to give your opinion if asked, Mr. Kurlinkus.
Yeah, and I think, the state's attorney has weighed in on this a couple times before. The only reason that your rules of procedure allow for an abstention is if you have some sort of financial dealing with the vote that's taken.
Okay, so what you're suggesting, I guess I would be in conflict with what occurred in a previous abstention where a gentleman claimed to have a financial conflict and he did not have a direct financial conflict. So I find that to be inconsistent, of course.
I don't know about that. I'm just telling you what your rules of order and procedure say.
So with that, what we'll do is, Mr. Butita, would you like to change your vote? I'll give you that opportunity, but I will not insist upon it. I'm okay with that. If there's a concern over the process.
Yeah, no, I'd like to stay with the abstaining.
Okay, thank you very much. With that, motion has passed and we'll move on to new business. And I'll go back to Mr. Arena, who I think it would be appropriate if there's an update. I know there were questions in the Democrat caucus regarding the administrator search. A little bit of information was given down to 3. And if I heard you right, Mr. Arena, that the subcommittee that is working will have interviews in the next couple of weeks. And then there would be an action item on the second board meeting of June. It would go to the second cycle. It would go to committee, Personnel and Policy Committee, and then to the full board at the end of June for a vote. Is that accurate from a timeline standpoint?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I wouldn't say that we have a defined timeline right now because we're going to have to rely on getting everybody together. So this was reported to me on Tuesday, and what I was directed to do is to discuss within the county how we manage confidentiality for these candidates who may have not disclosed to their employers that they're seeking other employment. I had a conversation with Chairman Haney, with Mr. Chapman, and with Mr. Kurlinkas on how that might take place. I need to circle back. I need to circle back with workplace tomorrow to just discuss what happened. So because of the virus, workplace has not been able to do any in-person interviews yet with these people. They've done them online. What we would like to do is have the ad hoc committee attend an interview session conducted by Michael King, and we would observe the interview so we could get a sense from them in person. And then that those members of the ad hoc would have an opportunity to ask some follow-up questions or some clarification. And then from there, we would have to decide ourselves how we're going to make the selection. I guess in my mind, the ad hoc committee would make a recommendation to personnel and policy because we're advisory. And from there, then it would come to the full board. I know we're all anxious to get it done as quickly as possible. I am also. So we would stick with the timeline that Chairman Haney had suggested as best as we can. There's travel arrangements that need to be made for some of the people. And Lorraine Logan had also suggested after these in-person interviews, possibly hosting like a meet and greet before we make a formal offer, so that the other elected officials can meet the individual and get a sense for them and maybe weigh in with the board on what their preference might be. So, but I'm welcome to answer any questions. If you have questions, please ask.
Mrs. Crosby, go ahead.
I want to thank Paul for the work he's done. He's done an excellent job. The concern I have is the Personnel and Policies Committee, who was responsible for this, has put everything at Paul's feet and he's carried the water, and they have not moved this thing forward in 12 months. Now, I run a company. If I lost my CFO or my COO, I would not wait 12 months to hire another. So I'm very concerned with the agenda of Personnel and Policies, and are they serving Winnebago County in their best interest? That's my concern. Thank you.
Yes, thank you, Mrs. Crosby. Mr. Webster.
Yeah, thank you. You know, all this discussion came up, and I suggested right off the get-go that we hire GovHR to do the search. And all of a sudden, there was a bunch of pushback on GovHR, mainly because most of you wanted to hire someone local, a local firm. I argued the point there that GovHR strictly is in the business of finding people for government jobs, whether they're school board or county board or city or county or village, whatever. But that's their specific field that they do. And so many people on this board, most of you actually, said, you know, we should hire somebody local. Why are we doing this for an outside firm? We need a local firm to do this. And so it came down to a vote of having a local firm versus GovHR, a professional firm that does nationwide searches. Well, I was in the minority on that, and it wound up that we went with the local search firm. And I don't want to take nothing away from them, but I just argued then, and I will now, that they were not geared for going strictly for government type workers. And furthermore, GovHR said that they could come up with a interim administrator at no charge whatsoever. And furthermore, now this came out of Personnel and Policy, and I argued that their charge was going to be $19,000, and then instead the committee, the board, and everyone voted to go with the local search firm at a cost of $35,000, and you voted for this on the board floor. And so, to come back and harpoon the Personnel and Policy Committee is totally wrong when the whole board had a right to vote on who to hire for this job. And so, without getting into, I don't know, private discussions about the firm, whatever, their firm that you hired had some personal issues, and that slowed down their process as well. And so then that slowed it down to the point there where, by the way, they came and put on a presentation. Anybody could have come and listened.
Point of order, Mr. Chairman. This is new business, not old business.
No, this is old business. This is old business, and I have the floor. Thank you.
Well,
This is new business.
I have the floor, Mr. Fellers. I have the floor.
Mr. Webster, hold on. Mr. Fellers, because of this topic was raised, because it's pertinent to the rest of the process playing out, we'll give a little bit of room on this one. But I would ask Mr. Webster, since I'm giving you a little room, let's be a little slower to call questions in the future, because I want to give you a little room, but maybe some of the rest of us want room on other items. So go ahead, sir.
Well, at any rate, so a lot of this is what slowed the process down. It had nothing to do with policy and procedures slowing it down. Policy and procedures is waiting for the firm that you all voted on to come back with some candidates. And the things that slowed things down had nothing to do with policy and procedures. And so could we light a fire underneath the search firm? Well, it's pretty tough to do. They claim, they gave us a report that they claimed that they had a lot of interested parties and something like 20 or 30, whatever the heck it was. And then they ferreted it down to the group that we have now. But all this went through some personal problems they had. And then along comes this COVID virus BS, which once again, the policy and procedures had nothing to do with COVID-19, slowing the process down.
Thank you very much, Mr. Webster. Mr. Fiducia, just to follow up on this topic, when did we hire Workplace again? I feel like that wasn't that long ago.
No, it wasn't. And I thank Mr. Webster for what he said, and it's apparent to me. It's apparent to me what's being said. I understand what's going on. So,
my question is, when did we engage Workplace to do this search?
You're probably going to have to check with Mr. Chapman, because I can't remember off the top of my head when it was. But there was some circumstances when we did hire them, as far as a personal injury accident and some things that were unforeseen that we just didn't have any control over. I don't know if Mr. Chapman might have the exact date, but it didn't seem like it was that long ago to me.
Okay, well, that I think is then worth noting, that it was pre-COVID. It wasn't that long. It might have been February, early March. I feel like it was in that time frame when we engaged Workplace. Is that correct, Steve or Mr. Arena?
Mr. Chairman, I believe it was the end of January.
Okay.
First part of February, somewhere in that area.
Okay, so right in that time frame. Okay, understood. And then going forward, we very likely, the target is to have an action item to a committee agenda to the Personnel and Policy Committee in the second cycle in June. That's the target. And then to the full board, end of June is the target. It could push into July, worst case scenario, but the target, the soft target, is the end of June. The question I have is, how is a decision going to be made? How does a name of the three, how do we get a name on an agenda? How does that process go from a subcommittee that was never not formally established with a board vote, but that is working on this item? How does that go from committee and then to a board agenda? And I'm not saying that if everybody agrees, I'm saying, well, what if there's a little bit of creative tension or disagreement in the process? How does a decision make its way onto a board agenda? Mr. Arena.
The ad hoc committee is advisory, so all we can do is make a recommendation to up to personnel and policy, or I'm open to whatever the will of the board is on that. If we just make a recommendation to the full board and let the board hash it out. We don't want to inundate the candidates with the entire board attending the interview. We could record the interview so that full board can view the interview. And like I said, none of the board members present are going to participate in the interview beyond maybe asking a brief, very focused follow-up question. We're going to observe Mr. King interview the individuals, asking each candidate the same questions. And all of the process up to this point, the selection has been done by the workplace. We're relying on their expertise. But ultimately, the selection, the approval is a vote of the full board. So the full board could make, I don't know, we could figure out a way that we, vet all three of them and selection that way, I suppose.
I'm just going to say it then for the record, is it doesn't sound to me like, in no disrespect, that there is a process, and that if there's disagreement, then I would be concerned that multiple people or multiple factions would want to be bringing forward different recommendations. And I guess my thing is I would just encourage that process to be in writing before anyone sits down with candidates, so that we have a clean way to make a decision, regardless of who's happy or sad about a decision, and then it makes its way. If it's not in writing, then you may have different people feel they're empowered to insert themselves in different ways in the process. Mr. Arena, on a follow-up.
So what if the ad hoc committee sit down and come up with a proposal for a procedure, and then the full board vote to approve the procedure for the selection?
I'm ambivalent to it. I'm just saying, I think that would be much better than maybe that would leave no room for confusion, respectfully, as you go forward, because that'll be an important part of the process for whatever that's worth. Thank you, Mr. Arena. I'll leave it back in your lap there, and the Personnel and Policy Committee. Yes, Mr. Schultz.
I thought, Mr. Arena, that the entity that we hired laid out a complete process from start to finish, and that was reviewed.
Thank you, Mr. Schultz. Can anybody speak to that, Steve or Mr. Arena?
I don't think that they laid out a procedure for this final selection. They are presenting us with three their best candidates that they determined, and now it's up to us to determine how we want to select from among those three.
Well, I really appreciate the discussion, but it would appear that maybe it's worth relooking at that contract just to make sure we didn't miss something. Two, if there isn't a written out procedure provided by workplace, that somebody creates one. That way everybody's clear, nobody's upset. But somebody's going to have to, or a small group's going to make a decision to put a name on the agenda. And I just wouldn't want to see there be a process dispute. But it sounds like you're on it. Any other questions on that matter? Seeing none, I'd entertain a motion to adjourn. I got a motion by Mr. Billick. May I have a second?
Mr. Chairman.
I'll second that.
Oh, I'm sorry, before I go back on that, Mr. Billick, go ahead.
I just want to offer up everyone an apology for tonight. Typically, I don't get bothered with the county board meetings, but I am at work and been at work, and I have a heavy bar cleanup, so I want to apologize for being in and out tonight, because I don't like to be that. So thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Billick. I got a motion by Mr. Billick to adjourn. May I have a second, please?
I got a second.
Second by Mr. Hoffman. Are there any board members opposed to the motion to adjourn? Seeing none, we are adjourned. Thank you. Have a good night.
Have a good night, everyone. Bye.